everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating episode. Our episode is about learning English with podcast conversation. Today our topic is dealing with those pesky computer problems we all face and how those situations can actually help you learn English. You know how frustrating it is when your computer freezes or just starts acting all weird? Well, today we're going on a deep dive into some real-life English conversations about computers. And guess what? You'll learn some super useful English phrases along the way.
It's like we're giving you a secret code book to understand those tricky tech conversations in English.
Okay, I was listening to this podcast and someone's computer was messing up.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of saying my computer's broken, they said my computer's acting up. Have you ever heard someone say that?
Oh, yeah. Acting up is a really common way to say something isn't working, right? It's more interesting than just saying broken.
Right.
And it kind of makes your computer sound like a naughty kid, doesn't it? It totally does. And later in the podcast, the computer completely freezes. The person says, the stupid computer froze again. Now, we all know that feeling, right? But how cool is it that we can express that frustration in English?
What's fascinating is how those simple words froze and acting up instantly paint a picture in our minds. We can all relate to that feeling of frustration when our technology doesn't cooperate.
Yeah.
And that shared experience helps us learn and remember these phrases.
It's like those phrases become little memory hooks. And speaking of memory hooks, the podcast also talks about keeping your software up to date. It's important for avoiding those nasty computer viruses.
That's right. But think about it, up to date isn't just for computers. We use it for lots of things. Like if you have the newest version of a map, it's up to date. Or a news report with the latest information is also up to date.
So you're learning one phrase, but seeing how it fits into tons of different situations. That's so much more helpful than just memorizing a word from a list, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of context in language learning. Words can have slightly different meanings depending on how they're used. And this podcast does a fantastic job of showcasing those nuances through real-life examples.
Okay, so we've talked about acting up, froze, and up to date. Did any other phrases from this podcast catch your ear?
You know, it's interesting. They use the phrase, "it turns out that," a lot. And it's such a versatile phrase. You can use it in so many situations.
Ooh, tell me more. I love learning new phrases. Can you give me an example of how I might use it?
Sure. Imagine you thought your friend was ignoring you, but then you found out they were super busy at work. You could say, "it turns out that they were just swamped with deadlines." See? It's like revealing a little secret or explaining something unexpected.
I get it. So if I thought I lost my keys but then found them in my pocket, I could say, "it turns out that my keys were in my pocket the whole time."
Exactly. You're a natural. And the podcast uses it in all sorts of scenarios, from funny ones like, "it turns out that I'm pregnant," which was obviously a joke, to more serious ones like, "it turns out that he was really sick."
I love that they're having some fun with it. It makes learning English feel less like a chore and more like listening to a friend tell a story.
And that's exactly what you want. Language learning should be enjoyable.
Yes.
And speaking of enjoyable, there was another phrase that stuck with me. "I'll be right up."
Ooh, I use that one all the time. It's so handy. Like if someone needs my help but I'm in the middle of something, I can just say, "I'll be right up."
Precisely. It's a casual way of saying, "I'm coming soon."
Right.
But it also implies you're willing to help. And guess what? The podcast also shows how you can tweak it.
Okay.
Like, "I'll be right down," if you're heading downstairs.
So if someone calls me from downstairs, I can shout, "I'll be right down." And they know I'm on my way.
Wow. It's amazing how much we can learn from just listening to people talk.
It is. And you're picking up on these everyday phrases that textbooks often miss.
Right.
These are the phrases real people use in real conversations. And that's what makes them so valuable for learning English. Okay, so we've covered acting, froze, up to date. It turns out that, and I'll be right up. But the podcast also sneaks in some cool computer words, right?
Absolutely. They talk about things like viruses and infected files, which are pretty scary sounding.
I know, right?
But don't worry, they also explain what antivirus software is and how a virus scan can help protect your computer.
It's like a mini lesson on computer safety, all while you're learning English. And they don't assume you're a computer whiz. They explain everything in a way that anyone can understand.
Exactly. They break down complex concepts into simple terms, making it easy for even beginners to follow along.
Yeah.
And you know, it's not just about understanding those specific words.
Right.
It's about getting comfortable with the whole conversation about computers and English.
So even if you're not a tech expert, you can still learn a ton of useful English from this podcast. That's pretty awesome, right?
It is, and it shows us that we can learn English from all sorts of places, even those that might not seem educational at first glance. Like, who knew computer problems could be such a great English teacher?
This deep dive is really blowing my mind. We've uncovered so many useful phrases and vocabulary just from one podcast conversation about computers.
And you know what's even more amazing? We've only just scratched the surface.
Wow.
There's so much more to explore in this podcast.
I can't wait to see what other treasures we uncover. But for now, I think it's time for a quick break. We'll be right back with more insights from our deep dive into learning English with podcast conversations about computers.
All right, so we've talked about some great phrases like acting up, froze, and up to date. And we've even touched on some technical computer terms. But you know what really makes this podcast special?
What's that? I'm all ears.
It's how they structure the whole thing to make learning English easier and more fun.
Okay,
They break down the conversation into smaller chunks so it's not overwhelming.
that makes sense. I've tried listening to podcasts before, and sometimes it's like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah,
Too much information all at once.
exactly. But this podcast is different. They play the conversation at normal speed first, so you get a feel for the flow and the context. Then they slow it down and focus on specific phrases and words.
So it's like they're holding your hand and guiding you through the language.
Right.
That's a much gentler approach.
Right, and as they break it down, they don't just tell you what the words mean. They give you examples of how to use them in different situations.
So it's not just about memorizing words, it's about understanding how to actually use them in real life. That's so much more useful.
Absolutely. And what's really cool is that they repeat the conversation several times,
Okay,
each time at a slightly faster pace.
it's like a workout for your ears.
Exactly. By the end, you've heard the conversation multiple times, you understand the vocabulary, and you've even had a chance to practice saying some of the phrases yourself.
It's like they're giving you all the tools you need to succeed. That's amazing.
It is. And it all comes from a simple conversation about computers. This deep dive is really showing us that you can learn English from anywhere as long as you're paying attention and engaging with the language.
Speaking of engaging with the language, there's something called fluency builders that this podcast uses. What are those all about?
Fluency builders are like secret weapons for sounding more like a native speaker.
Oh,
They're phrases and expressions that native speakers use naturally,
okay.
but they can be tricky for learners to grasp.
So it's not just about knowing the words, it's about knowing how to put them together in a way that sounds natural.
Exactly. In this podcast, they focus on the phrase acting up. Remember how we talked about that earlier?
Yeah, it's much more interesting than just saying not working properly.
Right. And the Fluency Builder explains that using phrases like acting up adds personality and color to your language.
So it's like adding a little spice to your English.
Exactly. And by highlighting these fluency builders, the podcast helps learners to go beyond basic vocabulary and grammar and start developing a more natural speaking style.
That's awesome. So it's like they're giving you the tools to not just understand English, but to really own it and use it confidently.
Precisely. And that's what makes this podcast so valuable. It's not just about teaching you words, it's about helping you become a more confident and fluent English speaker.
Okay, so we've talked about the structure of the podcast and fluency builders, but there's another layer to this: cultural insights. How does that play a role?
You see, language isn't just about words and grammar.
Right.
It's also a reflection of the culture it comes from. And this podcast does a great job of weaving in those cultural insights.
So it's like learning about the culture behind the language, which makes it so much more interesting.
Exactly. For example, in the podcast, there's a part where the characters joke about kicking and hitting their computers out of frustration.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Of course, we don't actually recommend doing that, but it shows a common cultural experience feeling frustrated with technology.
It's like a universal language of frustration.
Right. And by incorporating these relatable cultural references, the podcast makes the language learning experience more engaging and memorable.
It's like you're not just learning words, you're learning about the people who use those words and the context in which they use them.
Precisely. It's about connecting with the culture behind the language, which can make your learning journey much more enriching.
I love that. So it's not just about learning to speak English, it's about understanding the culture that shapes the language.
Exactly. And this podcast does a fantastic job of weaving those cultural insights into the learning experience.
This deep dive is really eye-opening. I'm realizing that there's so much more to language learning than I initially thought.
There is. And the more you explore, the more you'll discover the fascinating connections between language culture and the human experience.
I can't wait to keep exploring. We've talked about fluency builders and cultural insights. But you know what really strikes me? This podcast doesn't just teach you English. It encourages you to take charge of your learning. It's like they're saying, hey, we're here to guide you, but you're the captain of your own language journey.
What's fascinating is how they do that. Throughout the podcast, they're always asking questions like, did you catch that phrase? Or what do you think this word means?
It's like they're nudging you to think for yourself, not just passively listen. They want you to actively participate in the learning process.
Exactly. And by doing that, they help you develop a sense of ownership over your learning.
Right.
It's not just about following instructions, it's about making the language your own.
I love that. It's so empowering. It's like they're giving you the keys to the language kingdom and saying, go explore.
Precisely. And with the tools and guidance provided by the podcast, you can confidently set off on your language adventures.
Speaking of tools, they do a really cool thing with technology. They provide transcripts of the conversation so you can read along as you listen.
That's so helpful, especially for visual learners.
Yeah.
It's like having a safety net. You can always check the transcript if you miss a word or a phrase.
And the transcripts aren't just plain text.
Right.
They often highlight key vocabulary and grammar points so you know what to focus on.
It's like having a personal tutor pointing out the most important parts. And some podcasts even have interactive exercises and quizzes based on the conversations.
Wow, that's taking it to a whole new level. It's like turning language learning into a game.
Exactly. And games are fun, right?
Yeah.
This podcast really understands that learning should be enjoyable. And you know what else is enjoyable? Connecting with other people. And this podcast helps you do that too.
Wait, really? How does a podcast help you connect with other people?
Well, many podcasts have social media groups or online forums where listeners can interact with each other.
It's like having a built-in community of fellow language learners. That's awesome. You can ask questions, share tips, and encourage each other.
Exactly. And some podcasts even organize live events or meetups where listeners can connect in person.
Wow, that's taking it to a whole new level. It's like turning language learning into a social activity.
And social activities are fun. Remember, this podcast is all about making language learning enjoyable. And you know what else is enjoyable? Discovering new cultures. And guess what? This podcast helps you do that too.
Seriously, how does learning about computers connect you to other cultures?
Well, think about it. Technology is global. People all over the world use computers. And this podcast, by featuring conversations about computers, subtly exposes you to different cultural perspectives.
So it's like getting a glimpse into how people from different cultures think and talk about technology. That's pretty cool.
It is. And it helps you develop a deeper understanding and appreciation for other cultures, which is so important in today's world.
Absolutely. This deep dive has been such an incredible journey. We've learned so much about how podcast conversations can help us learn English, connect with others, and even explore different cultures.
And you know what the best part is? This is just the beginning. There's a whole world of podcasts out there waiting to be explored.
So to all you language learners out there, I encourage you to dive in, find podcasts that interest you, and start listening. You might be surprised at what you discover.
And remember, have fun. Language learning should be an enjoyable journey. So relax, embrace the challenge, and enjoy the ride.
That's great advice. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into learning English with podcast conversations about computers.
Thank you for joining us on this exciting adventure. Until next time, keep those computers running smoothly and keep those language skills sharp.
Bye, everyone.